Well, as you all know, this breakout session is called Global South Solidarity for Influencers, Decolonizing Our Queer Advocacy. This is a topic that is very important for us as an organization, and you will know more about that later as we go and talk a little bit about our history. And also, well, we wanted to start a little bit. My name is Nadia. I am from Mexico City. I was born and raised, and I've lived in Mexico City my whole life. And this is a conversation that we have talked like in Soulforce and also in other spaces with the people that we work with in Latin America about how big the influence, like social media influence is from the US and creation content in the US in other countries, specifically in my case in Latin America, and how normalized that is for US content creators and how not very, how we don't really talk about that much, and how people that go through these deconstruction processes or like coming out processes in other countries, most of the content that whenever we, even if we look for like Google, puedo ser gay y cristiano in Spanish, we will get content from the US. That's what we will get. And how that process is something that we are familiar with. Those of us that have, like, we know what it is to have to translate things to learn about our own experience. And also we have talked about activists in other countries. And that process is very like familiar for us. And I don't know how much people in the US think really about that. How much we are familiar with learning to empathize with stories that sound like ours, but at the same time, they don't sound like ours. And yeah, like trying to make that process of taking, like filtering, right? And like there are so many things that resonate and that are very healing. And whenever you talk to like activists in Latin America, they will tell you how grateful they are for content creators in the US, but they will also tell you all that little things or big things that didn't resonate or were not really contextualized to their processes, both like in a micro level, like this just doesn't seem like my story because of my family wasn't like that, or like in a micro level, and also like on a macro level. I think one of like these big examples I've heard a lot of moments here in the conference talking about Exodus. Exodus Latin America still exists and it's alive and well. It's a part of Exodus Global Alliance, and most of the conversion therapy in Latin America is funded by US missionaries, and that is going pretty well. If you tell people in Latin America about the Exodus process in the US, I don't think many people will be familiar with that because in Latin America it exists and it works. Like, and also if you go like talking about macro structures, if you listen to the main right-way activists or people in like voices in Latin America, you will find, that's a fact, you will find links to the US. Like I was researching like Agustin Laje from Argentina, like he wrote a book about like denying the horrors of Argentinian dictatorships in the 70s, and he got a grant from the, let me tell you the name of the school. He got a grant from the Defense University here in Washington, D.C. to study counterterrorism with a full grant. And he is right now one of the biggest voices in like of the religious right in Latin America. And every big voice, like, and every influencer, and we will talk more about what it means to be an influencer, but they have those links and they have those resources. So we wanted to politicize or like join this conversation to politicize that process of being an influencer from the States and talking about these topics, right? And we know how brave it is to share your lived experience. And we don't want you to not do that because that's what Christian supremacy wants us to do, like just not share our stories, but we do want to make those connections and like think out loud what it means and how we can be more careful and about that. And this is important for us as an organization, Soulforce, because this organization comes from a process like that. And I think Alba will talk a little bit more about what it means.
So this is our founders, Mel White and Gary, his husband. And I say it like that because a lot of times we only hear about Mel White, but his husband, Gary, is one of the founders of this organization and played a really important role, even if it wasn't on paid staff. But about 25 years ago, this communication specialist, what we would call an influencer now, Mel White, wrote this very now famous book called Stranger at the Gate. And it was one of the first times that somebody had published a mainstream book about being gay and Christian in the US. And because of his former engagement with the religious right, the moral majority, and being a ghostwriter and a comms person for some of those, that it kind of was scandalous because it was like this flip, even though he himself actually came from a very progressive town in California, and his father was also a very progressive pastor. But it was a beautiful spin in the world where they were like, somebody turned code and turned out to be gay and all of that stuff. So he wrote this book that is very famous. Everywhere we go, we still have every conference, every speaking gig, I still have somebody come up to me and say, this book saved my life. This book changed my life. I met Mel White once. He is now in pretty frail health, but loves us and backs us 1,000%. But it's important for us to be really honest about the fact that we were started by white gay men with privilege, and with a lot of access to mainstream media and those kinds of things. And so Soulforce always cared about race, like King and Gandhi were two of the figureheads in the very beginning of like the kind of theologies and ideologies that we were trying to work on with nonviolent resistance. But that isn't who you can see, who isn't in front of you today. And it has been a process of understanding that being inclusive of other races of people is not the same thing as centering those most impacted. And so the ED before us, their name is Haven Heron, and Haven started right out of college. And ever since Mel White hasn't been the executive director for like almost 20 years now. And yet still Soulforce, almost everyone, almost everywhere above a certain age is like, oh, Soulforce, Mel White, Stranger at the Gate, right? And so Haven started as a young person, got radicalized around all kinds of systems of oppression. And in around 2014, 2015, made a hard left turn, basically. And the orientation was understanding that it was not by mistake that every boardroom of every Christian college that Soulforce visited in its early years was made up of a room of white, straight men, right? And so this idea of racism, homophobia, misogyny, that they all go together, and that the underlying understanding of white supremacy is the foundations of so much of the discrimination and harm that we see amongst lots of groups. So all that to say, when that shifted, 2014, the board was cleared, the staff was pretty much cleared. I was the first hire, Joss was the second hire. And that had paved the way basically for this being the first generation of Soulforce that isn't run or led by white people or a majority white board. And that's been a really hard process. Like, that has taken many years. It also took a brave ED who was white and had access to wealth to say, I am moving aside. I am trying to create, like a grant base so that we're the first working class. We were the first working class directors. We were the first generation immigrant directors, like all of the first everythings, because it's not a surprise, or it shouldn't be a surprise, why so many of our organizations are led by white people with access to money or gay men, because even in the process of like academia, when we see theology in Latin America, there's a head start of like who can get in first and then who can get in next. And so I really actually admire a lot of the leadership of organizations, including ours, who was like, okay, how do I support and not just move out of the way and let y'all figure out how to do this, but actually try to build that. And so we're continuing to live the repercussions, both financially and otherwise, of going from a white upper class donor base to centering people, working class people of color, queer and trans people, women, et cetera. And so all that to say, at this moment, you find us with queer and trans leadership in the staff, in the board, majority people of color by far, and more than half of our staff is located outside the US. So we have folks from Colombia, Costa Rica, and Mexico. And the fact that Nadia can be here is even a privilege, right? Because most of our staff can't get a visa to get into the US to attend a conference like this. So I think I'll just stop there of like, that's kind of where we come from. We went from being an organization that was pushing for inclusion in places like church spaces and Christian college campuses of LGBT people to actually being a more radically leftist organization that understands that all the systems of oppression are intertwined. And anytime Christianity, which is the religion of power in this continent, and in this hemisphere, that anytime Christianity is used as the reason why somebody shouldn't have rights or shouldn't have equal access or shouldn't be able to live their life in abundance as we believe God intends, that is where we show up, not just for queer people, not just around gender or sexuality issues, but actually like we are a capacity building organization and a strategic thinking partner for anybody's struggles for liberation, where they encounter a kind of religious, particularly Christian content that's saying like, no, you don't get to be your full self. You don't get to have access to those rights because God said, or the Bible said, and that's kind of where we work now.
Yes, and like talking more about, it's good. I think it's nice to see how from this Stranger at the Gate book that was so important, now we have all these resources. Here are the versions in Spanish, but you can get the ones in English in our website that are not centered in one person's lived experience, which is very valuable. And we have already said it changed and saved a lot of lives. But how we can make that switch and how we can use social media, and that's why we are here. We might talk a little bit more about these resources and these processes that we have gone through. There's some pictures of the work we do, but like going more through the social media part and how we think about influencing. Asada has something to say about that.
Hi.
Tell us, Asada.
Meg is going to hand out a survey to everyone that we're going to go through together. Like, we want this part to be super interactive, because we want people to understand that we're all doing this in solidarity. So this is something that we regularly do as well, take account of the things that we're posting on our social media. So we want you to know that if there's something that you're talking about on your social media that you're passionate about, we don't want you to stop talking about it. We just want you to contextualize who else is talking about this, and that possibly you have an opportunity to actually amplify those voices. So we're going to go through a few of these statements together, and you just kind of, based on your own social media, from 1, I have no idea, to 5, I'm completely aware of where it is on your personal accounts. So, and then we'll discuss some of these together. So the first one is, I know the overall demographics of my followers. So the age group, gender, geographic location, and other information. And so where would you rate that in your own social media? Oh, I'm sorry. There's a back and a front. Oh, there we go. Oh yeah, sorry. My bad. I'll make sure we.
And then see what people
Okay.
do you think in terms of, I'm worried about time because I talked a long time.
Okay.
So
So just read through them one by one. Okay.
And we're going to read them because if you're on the live stream, you don't have this little piece of paper. So you can read them on our little chart, but we'll also read them so for folks for accessibility.
Okay. And so the next thing we have is I know that I have followers who live outside of the US and I know where those countries are. I know why my followers outside of the US are interested in my content. I know the main narratives used against LGBTQI people in the countries where my followers live. I know the names of the conservative extremists influencing the countries where my followers live. I have explored ways to use my platform to benefit activists. I have a relationship with a grassroots organization in the place where I live. I am aware of other creators from different contexts and geographies who discuss the topics I post about. I have a relationship with a grassroots organization in the countries where my followers live. And I have a regular practice of connecting my followers to the resources they tell me they need. Okay.
I will see
There-
people, and I can move around with the microphone.
Okay, yeah, because we have some of these we wanted to ask about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we have a few of these that we would love feedback from people, from y'all on. One of them is, I know why my followers outside of the US are interested in my comment. Is that something that any of you have ever thought about what is it that you are actually giving to people in other countries and why they're interested in following you? And if you want to share about that, what it is that you feel your content gives to those people. Yeah, it's the third one on the list, which is I know why my followers outside of the US are interested in my content. So what is it that you feel that your content is giving to those people? And if that's something that you've even thought about at all.
Or if it's something that you're interested in giving to people outside the US, what would that be? Or what do you think that gift might be?
I think they were trying to.
Hold on.
Your microphone.
I mean, I've lived abroad a little bit, studied abroad, worked abroad for my job. So I was in India for 6 months, China for 6 months, but like but I think most of the followers that I have are friends or people who I know from there, as opposed to like just random. I mean, that happens too or whatever, but I guess I don't have much of an international.
Maybe we also need to talk about who is an influencer, because I get this from those two often.
Hello, my name is Sarah Cunningham, and I'm the founder of Free Mom Hugs and accidental activist. I have a gay son, and that journey brought about the organization, nonprofit Free Mom Hugs. And what I hear most from people outside the United States is that we give them hope, and that they're always asking for Free Mom Hugs to go where they are. And so I love the power of social media. It's helped Free Mom Hugs in the national pandemic, a nonprofit based on physical touch. It allowed us to go beyond the hug. And what I realized through our social media is that it was a way to keep our followers, I feel funny calling them followers, our friends and family, but it helped keep them connected during the beginning of the pandemic. And we were able to get creative within our nonprofit to have like a national pride ride or care packages, things like that. So we give people hope, we give people a connection, and it encourages us as an organization to want to go there. And we see it as becoming possible, a possibility, and that gives great hope.
I love that.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Black, she, her pronouns. I run an organization called Kaleidoscope, and our ministry is based in New York, very incarnational. So though we try to focus most of our work in New York City, doing evangelism and sometimes a very yucky word for a lot of post-evangelicals, missions work, in New York City. We've also found that a lot of people outside of the city and internationals have reached out to us for help and advice as to how they can think about missional proclamation in their countries. So I think similarly, just the sheer existence of our organization allows people to say, oh, I have permission to think about how to share the gospel and love and serve my LGBTQ neighbors in my context. But for us, it's such a blessing because we get to learn from them. Again, to decolonize the experience of missions, we don't want to come in and say we know how to do it because we don't know their cultural context in the same way. So learning from them about what their culture is like, what is the queer experience in those spaces has been really valuable. So one example is we partnered with an organization in El Salvador recently. And I was on vacation, so I was able to go and be with them. We brought COVID tests for them, but they do all the work of caring for trans folks in El Salvador who are facing, violence and murder because of that. So just being a resource in partnership more than like telling people what to do has been really great.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is TJ. I'm a Chicano man, but I've also lived a lot of my life in East Africa, and I still live there. I have a podcast called Communion and Shalom, and we come from a side B perspective. So there's kind of a mix between the dominant structural forces that move in the Christian space are usually side A. They have lots of money. They have the power of the US government, for example, which is side A supporting in a certain sense. Or side X. Exodus International also exists on the African continent. So in some way, we're a middle way in a certain way. And in fact, there's people who, they don't use the term side B. That's not how people are using the terms in East Africa. But they still are closer to a side B ethic. That's kind of what they're trying to pursue in life. So a lot of my question is connecting with the Africans that I've lived a lot of my life among, as well as Chicano people and US people, because I have relatives in all the three places. So I know who they are. And the question is, how do we pursue that? Especially because we'll be using English. We'll be using some of the categories of the US or side B, for example. The sides again are not East African. And also there's more violence in East Africa at the potentiality if you come out. So even me, I'm semi-closeted. The queer people I know in East Africa are closeted-ish, but at the same time, the conversation is different. And it's less homophobic than people might expect, but it's more homophobic in other ways that people may not know of. So when I think about decolonizing my particular positionality, I don't know. I've always lived on a lot of boundaries, a lot of in the borders of a lot of communities. So it's kind of an open question, but I think centering these people who live at the boundaries of the borders, being queer and Christian, being like maybe Chicano, being African, being whatever, these are the questions that I'm trying to pursue. I think part of that is that you talked about this work of centering. And also this work of intrinsic is side B, I'm in the middle again. It's also a borderland, So yeah, and I think being openness to that things are more complicated, there's more nuance. Sometimes activists diminish the nuance in pursuit of their own goals. And I think it's worthy being skeptical, having a hermeneutic of suspicion of that movement, even if you try to have ultimately a hermeneutic of charity for the people who are working in these spaces. So thank you.
Who else wants to join the conversation?
I want to say to what you had asked about influencers, I think that's important that we sort of kind of define that before we go on. I feel that as queer people, so much of our lives are politicized by other people, by the religious right, by white Christian supremacy. They have already politicized our identities. And so it is something that is very hurtful to us, but we also don't realize that power in that we can take back of that. So all of that information that we're putting out there. So a lot of people say like, oh, I'm just sharing my story, but we don't realize the grand effect that has on other people. And so just as they're using our stories like against us, we can actually use that to better our community. And so I know, as Alba kind of mentioned earlier, we tease them all the time about that they are an influencer. Even they post like once a month on social media. Like it doesn't have to be like we have this whole idea of like content creators and like what that has to be. But like for us, we're in a unique position like as queer people that we have these amazing survival stories that genuinely can impact other people's lives. And so just by us, like that comes with great responsibility, but also with us just being able to share our stories, that makes us influencers. And so we have the power to not only help other people, but influence legislation, like all of these things, like just by us sharing our stories. So anyone that puts any sort of information out there, especially as a person in a marginalized group, you are an influencer. So I hope that answers that question.
Yes. And also there's this other thing about we have to, like right now, social media and content creation, like there is a whole infrastructure, like those voices being heard more than activists in Latin America is not a matter of the heart of US content creators, but it has all these like algorithms and how those things work, right? And how the attention economy and the way we share the things, how they get like, yeah, how they get attention from the public or from the media, that has a lot of things that are not in the control of the people that can be doing that for a nice reason, because they want to share, because they understand how powerful their stories are. And we want to expand that conversation and not make it till like from a place of guilt or like you have to be responsible of all that algorithms. That's not the thing, but we do think we have agency about how we look for these organizations, like being intentional in. I like these questions we had about how, if you are aware of other content creators that talk about the things that you are passionate about in other contexts, right? Like I'm thinking about the Free Mom Hugs. I would really like to know how that, because I know it happens in Mexico. Like I've seen like mothers doing that. And I would love to see how they can benefit for your resources, but they can also share other stories, because Latinx moms are different, right? And the way we are connected with that are different. So that process of being intentionally looking for those connections and nurturing and giving our resources and sharing experiences, that I think can is like defying the capitalistic logic of social media, like of like partnership, like performative partnership, maybe. I don't know how to call it, but yeah, that's what I was going to say. And I would like to know if you have more comments or things that came to your mind as you were reading the prompts in our, yes, all these prompts.
I actually really appreciated the order that these were put in, because I got a little cocky in the beginning, being like, oh, I'm good. And then I got down to, do I know the names of conservative extremists? And I was like, I don't have a, like, and I realized that my awareness like stops hard at a certain point, and I have a lot of growing to do in that area. So I thought that was just illuminating for me personally.
And that one is important, I think, because as you were saying with your experience in East Africa, it's at East Africa, right? When we are an organization are really happy and proud about our work, like with grassroots organizations in Latin America. That's something that I think is very valuable to us, and we feel very honored for that. And we can like it's important, like how much your language even has to change, whether like whenever you go to certain places, or like you have to be aware of the ways activists, because activists in Latin America, I'm talking about Latin America because I'm from Latin America, but like we know like how to filter, as I was saying, right? Or we try to know how to, like, whenever like side A, side B conversations are not a thing in Mexico, right? And I have to like switch that thing whenever I'm in the States and whenever I'm talking to those people. And I think we can and should, as content creators, or you as content creators in the US, also try to make that, not also try to make those switches, or like understanding what is happening in terms like in policies, for example, or like how, like what is it, like the narratives in, we were talking about it, our partners in Cuba, the way the religious right talks about LGBTQ people, it has some similarities, but it also has like very like some specific languages that relate more to the culture, because we know that those discourses are usually using things that are already ingrained in the cultures. We know that they use the fear of the people, and they use those things and they mixed it with a little Bible, and that happens in Latin America, but the culture in which they were formed are different, and we should try to be at least familiar with those words, like the way we are familiar with how do you call it, dog whistles? Is that like those tiny words that you use, that we like here in the US? I think you are familiar with the type of words those groups use. It's good to be familiar with how that works in other countries, specifically the context where your content is familiar or popular, right? Mm-hmm.
And I think a huge part of how you do that is with one of the things we mentioned on here is that I have a relationship with a grassroots organization in the countries where my followers live, and the emphasis on relationship, because so many of us will be like, oh, I follow them on Instagram, or they follow me, and that's not a relationship. And so actually taking the time to be able to communicate and like, each other's names and actually forming a relationship is super important. Another thing that we want to go ahead and transition into now is that we feel as influencers, we have to make these commitments together for global queer solidarity. And so these are 4 of the things that we have committed to together. And because both of us used to be teachers, we would love to ask for volunteers from the class for people that can take one of these each to read out loud.
We're not above calling on
Nadia-
people.
I was like, Nadia will call on people if you know, so
I'm starting.
Checking our savior complex. No one is saving anyone here because all of our souls are on the line. We will never end white Christian supremacy until all of us are free from violence and discrimination.
And I think it's important that we start it with this one, because that is the basis of everything we wanted to talk about here today, that like none of us are in this great authority, like we are all in this together and we're all figuring it out. And that's the importance of solidarity, is understanding that we're all on the same level. No one's saving anybody.
Another person? Thank you.
Getting passionate about listening and learning. There's so much focus on US-centric narratives about queerness. Seek out videos, movies, stories, and other media made by queer people in the global South.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Valuing relationships. Solidarity requires mutual trust and respect. We find ways to make genuine, lasting connections across differences and distance.
Thank you.
One more.
Seeking sameness. Let your image of LGBTQI community expand across borders, cultures, languages. There's so many ways we can relate to each other.
We can do that.
We have a
Yes.
little time left. Yeah.
Yeah, we have time left, and
Okay. Okay. Is there anything else that any of you feel that we can add to our list of commitments that we make to show our solidarity?
Can I expand on one of them as from my position as a participant and not as a facilitator of like I think the learning about others is really important and also sensitivity. So for example, I think in Latin America, more often we're seeing a lot of folks like reclaiming more earthy kinds of traditions where people are now interested in herbs and candles, and it doesn't feel as much like it's heretical. But in Kenya and Uganda, and absolutely in Rwanda, for example, anything that is not explicitly Christian is still seen and called demonic and witchcraft. And recognizing that for me, I'll just share from my experience, even though I know that a big part of the reason that those things are considered demonic and witchcraft was because white colonizers went to those places and told those folks that that was demonic. And therefore, now we're like decolonizing stuff over here and being like, that's part of who we are too. For me, it was humbling as a pastor trying to, share my experiences to really have to learn and be mindful of if we're using flowers to like douse the person next to us to bless them, that can trigger all kinds of extra layers that have been like discrimination on top of being LGBTQ. And so it's not my job. For me, I want to be like, no, but you see, it's the white colonizers who told you weren't allowed to use feathers or you weren't allowed to light candles or whatever. That's not my job. That's not my role. And that was a big humbling moment for me. Or it's been a process of being sensitive to like, it's still illegal for you to exist as who you are in this country. I don't need to be adding more to your list from my great US authority, even though I come from a marginalized or a couple of marginalized identities within the US. So I think there's like something also about being sensitive. Like our first Sodom and Gomorrah resource with Soulforce had a snake, like our serpent dove is ours, like reclaiming Matthew, I send you out, be as cunning as serpents and as innocent as doves. That's like our kind of our unofficial motto. But for that context, for many contexts, actually, not just East Africa, if you put a snake on a thing, you better not be talking about the Bible. You are like representing all that is evil and bad and whatever. So I just want to share that story because I think there's a part about being sensitive to who's on the other side. And you can still do whatever you want, but recognizing how that might be read or misread from a different context.
And even I was thinking about when we were planning this breakout session, we were trying to be very careful about not feeling like we were like pointing out like you are doing this wrong, right? Like how not to fall into that shaming cycle. And because like people that came from a religious tradition and white Christian supremacy, the way it works is in binaries, and it's like using shame, right? And using like, it's very hard for you to point out something. It's very hard to say, I don't know this, like looking at one of these prompts and be like, I don't know it. I don't know. And not feeling like that is a moral failure, like I'm bad, like in that binary of being a good versus a bad person. So we want to like nurture that, like being able, like that self-awareness without falling into that binary, because we know how important those experiences are. And preparing for this breakout session, I talked to people like our friends that are activists in other countries, and all of them have these stories of, I was so invested in this influencer, and then I just started to realize all these things that didn't fit my, like they all have these moments of that doesn't fit my experience, but it came from a place of gratitude, and like they felt very connected, and they felt that empathy. So like yeah, I was just thinking about how white Christian supremacy is so ingrained in us that it's so difficult to not think of it in a transactional way. And like or like even be more like a martyr, like I need to be there, I need to tell their stories or whatever, like, and not think about it in a relationship way. Like I want to learn about this because I want to know why is it that my experience that is so far away from theirs resonates. I want to know like what we were thinking, right? Like getting passionate about listening and learning and being curious from a place that doesn't come from a saviorism place, right?
But so much of like just us living in like a capitalist economy that we think in terms of like transactions and not just like being happy for each other's success and being like in relation. We just think in terms of transactions.
Thoughts, comments, questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Brian Schubert Hehem. I love what you just said about capitalism. And I think one of the tenets of capitalism is so heavily entwined with philanthropy and this idea that we can give money and then we almost get power and influence in return for it. And the thing that I feel like you all are calling out that's really been on my mind a lot lately is how do we have a like almost philanthropic approach to giving away our power and influence? So as a cisgender white man, how do I take that privilege that I have and actually donate it to other communities? And it's something that I feel like I've worked the last couple of years on like getting better at, but this has really been helpful for me to just see like, I need to do better. And I want to do better. And like, we live in Phoenix and have so many amazing members in our community from the global South. And just, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I guess I want to go home and just really make sure in everything I'm posting that I'm helping to put myself to the back so that some of these other voices that we can really learn from and challenge some of our perspectives could be shared more. So I just wanted to say thank you, I guess. Yeah.
And also it's not, I don't think it's about like, I don't want it to feel like we are urging you to deny yourself or carry your cross, because we know who does that, and we don't want to like reproduce that like mindset, right? We don't want that, because we want you to bring your full self to a table and then meet others' full selves in that table, right? But yeah, thank you for your words. Was there another? Oh,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
we want to.
I just think it's really nice, and maybe to like contextualize things in terms of like there's kind of a big tent, you know, and many like patriarchy shows up pretty much everywhere around the world, but with different flavors. Same with homophobia, same with transphobia. With like my evangelical charismatic context in the US, like that's a particular flavor, but you know, scrolling on TikTok like a year ago or whatever, I end up, you know, deconstruction TikTok, sometimes on ex-Mormon TikTok. And so I think there can be like some differences regarding the flavors of different religious traditions, but also religious traditions as they're translated to different countries, cultures, languages. However, many things, you know, got mixed in. If like Catholicism in India, for example, will have a very like India Hindu flavor even, or, you know, indigenous religions in South America or so on. So it's, I don't know, it's interesting, but also I think it's something special when you're able to have visibility from someone from that culture, like a free mom hug from a Latina mom and so on. So I think there's something very special there, I guess, about that visibility. At the moment, by the way, I'm around the Phoenix area too. Actually, I'm like doing van life, and I'm kind of like reclaiming some like butch, I don't know, butch masculinity, but progressive gay guy space, I guess there, but internationally. Go ahead.
One thing that's been important to me in thinking about some of these topics are to recognize that the people themselves have full agency. Like the people in East Africa are fully intelligent. They are fully able to make decisions about what their Christianity will look like. I will never deny, and I'm a pretty big critic in ways that put me in a bad position with my church community about like the colonial structures that exist in the past and how that altered my Christianity, their Christianity. But in the same way, they still make decisions to continue them if they value them, right? And there's all complexity there, but I think that nuance is the thing that the place we have to rest in and kind of struggle in. And that's my struggle. Not I will not say, hey, you're inauthentic because XYZ, like you're not doing how I think you should be doing. Even though I might say, I think this is better, consider it. But I won't say like you failed to be authentically African, authentically Chicano, authentically Mexican, authentically whatever. And yeah, I think that's just that's the human condition. And I think Jesus can meet us there in that tension and that wrestling and struggle. So.
And isn't it more interesting that way, where we can be full, faceted people?
Okay, I have been in my brain for like, because I feel the need to like name that, like been in my head, like because I feel like the question runs the risk of like deflecting, and I don't want to do that. And so I wanted to pose, I guess, a question to more of the audience instead of Soulforce, because like understanding this is like, yes, our collaborative like coalition work across like the global South, but like how I'm wondering, understanding that we are people who can walk and chew gum at the same time, like how do we have this conversation like within the United States, like even thinking culturally about this conference that we're at and how it does center whiteness, and like you were talking about like side A, B, X, it's not a thing in Black communities either. And so I'm like, so how do we have these conversations about queer influencers who are like trying to deconstruct I guess because the ones that come to mind, I won't say any names, but they're like very white centered, very don't take like any other cultures or like the way people express or practice Christianity into consideration. And so like, how do we do both, like within the US, get people to be more culturally sensitive and learn about other cultures and who's like looking at their content, and then also do it globally? That's it.
Yes, and Soulforce does South by Global South Solidarity also. So I'm just curious for our numbers, is anybody here from or living in the US South? Yes. Awesome. I'll check in to see where y'all are from. Just for us, it's helpful because we center the South. So we're like, did you get it? Are our Southern people here? Seems like they are.
I appreciate that comment because I was thinking that too. And I also don't want to turn away from the global conversation, though I think it's a part of it. And as a Black Latinx person, a queer person of color who's starting something, like I'm listening to all of your stories and thinking, man, it would have been really nice to have a white cis guy to start before me so that I could benefit off of that. So yeah, kudos. That's amazing. But yeah, I think it's a constant frustration for me because the primary dialogue that's happening in the States is from a middle class cis white male perspective. And every now and again, we get a great pleasure, but the pleasure of having a more female perspective, white middle class cis perspective. But that's about where it ends. And being in New York, where it's very multi-ethnic and global in and of itself, like the Black queer experience is completely different from the Chinese queer experience, which is different from the Latinx queer experience. So like, I think one, like we have a lot of work to do in the States as well to decenter and to give platform and voice and contextualize for our own multi-ethnic queer communities. But I also think as multi-ethnic queer folks, as BIPOC and AAIP queer folks, we have a unique ability to be empathetic, understanding, and hopefully platform more global voices because we have a shared experience. So that's what this has really encouraged me to do, is think like, I don't need to just uplift myself as a minority queer Christian voice, but I want to do more because I understand a little bit more of the global experience.
One of the statements on here is, I have a relationship with a grassroots organization in the place where I live. And I think that's really important, something that I've been reflecting a lot on in my advocacy work and like my personal life. We should not think that we can show up on the scene and we know everything and we have the best model and vision and stance, and that we can just go ahead and like dive in and do it, when there have been people who are already doing the work, who have been doing the work, who have learned through their mistakes, who have grown, who have built relationships. So I think a level of humility and coming up under those people and not needing to lead like not needing to be the influencer, like let yourself be influenced by the people who are already doing the work that you feel called to.
And I'm very thankful that you are like feeling that need to translate this to the US and how that works in your own context, but because that's something at least I cannot do. And we've had that problem in Soulforce, like in our programming. Like we do a lot of programming in Latin America, and it's very interesting and sometimes frustrating how when we try to, like we do a course in Latin America and we get 140 people registering, and then we all make all this effort to try to do a bilingual course in the US, and we get 0. No, we didn't get any US people from that effort, right? And it's something that I think you are more qualified to do in your own spaces, right? Like ask yourself those questions. Why is this a cultural thing? Is this the way we are more interested in listening to one person talking about their experience because we are ingrained in this influencer model, and it's hard for us to listen to an organization, or what is, I genuinely don't know how it works. And I think those are questions that I would really like to learn more about if you have those, like if you have those connections with activists or people in the US, because I know that people would love the things that course was about. Like I know it, but I just don't know what happens, right? And yeah.
I think so much of what you said about, instead of always being the influencer, allowing yourself to be influenced, because we do as influencers have these big amazing voices and these great stories to share, and the way we can really make this grow is by having that dialogue with other people and like being able to both be able to share our experiences. And so actually, were you sorry,
I'll just say one more thing related to this. Somebody else.
Okay, yeah, they were trying to.
Yes. It's just that Soulforce, like when I said, even now, everywhere we go, we still have, Soulforce, Mel White. The other side of that, being able to go on that legacy, is that now that we are not a like superstar one person model, it's much harder for people to be like, oh, Soulforce, y'all are still around, because there was that superstar that sold 100 million copies of a book in 16 countries or whatever. And now we don't use that as our strategy. So I just want to name, like, you do have to pay something on the other side. For us as an organization, it's worth it, but it means that there isn't one particular account that we can say, we're doing a 5-week course with one of the biggest experts in Latin America on queer feminist approaches to the sexuality of Mary in the Bible, and get 0 US participants, right? Like, who was it?
Hello, I'm Douglas. He is. I also have lived in East Africa for the last 20 years, and I think, and I completely agree that we don't not the fear of imposing. At the same time, we all come from a room full of incredible amount of education. Each of us here, we have 6 or 7 different lenses. We've learned to analyze situations from different perspectives, which allows us to even make sense of this meeting right here. And then I'll go into a group of my community, and one day I'll say, solve this. And after 3 hours, they have the same solution because they didn't know there was any other way to see the world. And I do that in economic development in different areas. And so how do we honor the fact that we are privileged and who we are today and our openness is a matter of fact of our education and our experiences? How do we learn how to introduce a community that's really done everything in one way, and every gender is one way, and every relationship is one way, and give them tools in a way to, because again, we are able to flourish as we do because of our privilege of education. And yes, many of them they're learners all the time, but how do we find that place to say, here's an alternative, or have you considered this, or have you walked it through? I mean, it is a balance, but we are able to be so open because of all the media we see, or all the books we have read, or all the people we have met. And then you meet a homogenous community. That's, I think, a big challenge I deal with is particularly the LGBT people I know, they're gay because of their online experience, and they've built a whole community online. But then they get off the phone and suddenly they're in a community that has nothing to do with that world. And that outer world is having to navigate this LGBTQ child, but they have no context. So all I'm saying is, how do we find our privilege, not to impose, but create, see what got us to where we are, maybe. I don't know if this is legit or not. But at the same time, just saying you figure it out when we figured out everything because of all our big connections and privileges we have. How do we offer those things to help them arrive somewhere that they just can't arrive without some of the, no, we couldn't have arrived without our privileges. If that makes sense. But again, just leaving them to themselves sometimes, particularly again with the social media context that isn't as prolific in their areas, or to every adult, or if they're completely illiterate and yet they're still crossing these boundaries. Just some thoughts.
I think the important thing out of what you mentioned is about valuing relationships and actually having relationships with people. Because I think if we're in authentic community with these people, we won't really like have those type of issues. And so with that is a nice plug for like our social media. We want this to be a continued conversation when we talk about amplifying each other's voices. And so we've created, and by we actually mean Joss, has created an amazing page that has all of our information. You can subscribe to our newsletters. You can follow us on social media. You can see our website, read our blogs, all of that, so we can continue to have these conversations. Oh, and we have stickers and buttons, and there is also a sign-up sheet too, if anyone wants to fill that out. Do you want to say anything else?
Well, just thank you for coming. Thank you for feeling that like call to like, thank you for looking at the title of our and the huge content warning and then just deciding to come anyways. And thank you for being here, and thank you for the conversation. It was really good for us to listen to you all.